Hi, this is Laura Pinto to tell you a little bit about my research. This is my book, Curriculum Reform in Ontario, published by University of Toronto Press, and it's based on my doctoral research. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. My doctoral research sort of stemmed from my own practice. I worked on secondary school reform in the late 1990s for the province of Ontario, and I had a couple of limited roles as a policy writer and also as a reviewer of some of the documents. And when I entered the doctoral program, that process was over, but I had a lot of questions about things that happened outside of my personal experience. And as I took my courses and started relating the theoretical content in my courses to my personal experience, I started to really formulate some more specific questions grounded in a theoretical framework of democracy, and more specific than that, critical democracy. So I came up with some questions that had to do with the degree to which curriculum reform during the 1990s in Ontario was democratic or not. What was interesting about it was the government of the time was very vocal about the transparency of the process and the amount of citizen participation. So they had teams and teams and teams of writers. They had stakeholders coming in during feedback sessions to provide feedback. And of course there were other people involved in the decision-making process and the policy production process, and that included political staff, so elected officials and their personal staffers, and the bureaucracy, right, the public servants who work for the government. So for my dissertation, my broad question, as I said, was to what degree was the process undertaken for curriculum reform democratic? But I identified a number of sub-questions. So the first one, quite obviously, is what is the specific process that was undertaken? Who was involved and what were their roles? How were decisions made about specifics around curriculum policy? And those are the main questions. I mean, there were kind of more detailed ones that are not worth probably getting into right now. So those questions drove my decisions around actual methodologies. So to answer those questions, I did not see quantitative methods as particularly useful. To reconstruct the policy process, I had to engage in historical and archival research. So I actually had to get permission and access the Archives of Ontario. And I had about 45 bankers' boxes of materials that are stored by the government that included correspondence, memoranda, reports, etc., etc. And so that was one point for me to use to try to reconstruct the process. But the documents only tell part of the story. So a huge part of my research was interview-based, and that was interviewing people who were involved at various levels of the process. So I interviewed curriculum writers, and these people were contracted through an outsourcing process. It was bids through something called MERCS that you may have heard of. I contacted a number of stakeholders who participated in feedback and consultation sessions. I had a number of bureaucrats that were able to speak to me, and I even had access to political staffers. So for those who recall that period of history, Mike Harris whiz kids. So it was a broad range of individuals, and I was able to ask them a lot of questions about their recollections, and I was able to triangulate my data. So in some cases, everybody had a similar perception or recollection of what happened, and in other cases, I never did get a clear-cut direction in terms of processes, discussions, that kind of thing. And that's fine. What it showed was that there were different perceptions, and it showed that perhaps people experienced it differently and perhaps people interpreted what happened differently. So once I assembled all of this data, so that's the historical archival data as well as the interview data, I constructed a case study. And so a case study is a methodology, and there's quite specific parameters around it. There's actually a great book called The Case for the Case Study that provides a lot of details, but a case study is basically something that can be bounded by time and bounded by process. So my case study went from about 1997 to 2000. And I stuck only to policy production. And of course, this is a little bit controversial because some might argue that how the policy gets produced and what's in the policy texts is inconsequential. It's really what happens when it hits the ground and people use it. I recognize that's a really valid piece of or aspect of the research, but I still do believe that if we believe in democracy, how public policies get produced are important. I also did not do content analysis of policy texts. I did look at participants' perceptions of policy text, and I did look at a little bit of secondary research, but again, to delineate the project and make it manageable, the analysis of policy text was beyond the scope of my research. But certainly that's something that I think is, again, warranted research, but that would be either another phase for me or something for another person to do. So that's the story of my dissertation research. I completed the research. That research was a big part of my recognition with the Governor General's Gold Medal. And once I defended the thesis and completed my work, my next phase was to work towards converting the thesis into a book, which is a job because you're writing for a different audience and for a different purpose, and it is blind reviewed, much like a journal. So I actually wound up doing quite a lot of revision when I transitioned from thesis to book, and that's, I think, an interesting aspect of research as well, because you do have to make changes depending on your purpose and audience. I found that to be a really interesting process, but I wound up revisiting my transcripts and my archival data and making sure that what was included, and particularly aspects of participant voice, but that all of that would be appropriate to the audience for a book. I've also published a number of related but different articles where I looked at different aspects of the data for different audiences and for different purposes. So the analysis that I did on the case study data was, I did constant comparative, but I also did a deductive analysis where I looked to themes and then worked towards, a theme was, social justice. So what did my transcript say about social justice? And what did my participants say? Another theme I looked for is policy learning. So what happens when participants engage in civic processes, and how does that affect their learning to be citizens and to engage in civic activities? And that was something that, again, I had to pull out from the data to answer those questions. So, as I said, some of these are in the dissertation and book and some are not, and that's just a matter of scope, because there's only so much you can put into one particular document. I think that's one of the great things about collecting data, and when you have asked the right questions and you have a rich set of responses from your participants, or a rich set of historical or archival data, as you start working with it, more and more themes emerge, both deductively and inductively, right? Deductive, where you're looking for something specific, and inductive, where you analyze the data looking for what emerges out of it. And so that was very exciting for me. I think I'm finally through with that data and moving on to a number of different projects. I hope that helped you get some insight into some research experience, and hopefully throughout the course I'll share some more experiences with you.